Good evening, everyone. I am really delighted to welcome you all tonight. My name is Rivenc, and I have the great pleasure of leading a project at the Getty Conservation Institute that is entitled Art in LA. And Art in LA is a project that aims at studying the materials and processes of LA-based artists starting from the 1950s onwards, and the implications that these materials and processes have in terms of conservation. And I can say that more broadly, it's a project that really seeks to engage the Los Angeles art community into a dialogue on materials and conservation. That's why I'm really delighted to see such a good group of people and such a diverse group of people here tonight. But the star of this evening, of course, is Helen Pashgian. I don't know if I really need to introduce her. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Helen's work, unless you just happen to stumble in here by accident, which is fine too. You're very welcome. Please stay. Helen has been working with light and industrial materials for the past 50 years. She was initially an art history graduate. She has a master in fine art from the University of Boston, but she decided instead, and we're very grateful for that, to become an artist, first a painter and then a sculptor. And she joined a number of Los Angeles-based artists in the 1960s who really explored the artistic possibilities of plastic and synthetic resins, all materials that were at the time really new and especially for use in art. Both James Turrell and recently Michael Govan, among others, have singled her out as a pioneer of light and space and indeed of art in general. Most of her early works, and here we can see a beautiful installation of her spheres in San Diego a few years ago. Robin Clark, who curated that show, is here tonight, actually. So most of her early works were intimately scaled objects that really explored qualities of translucency and color and created delicate shifting effects. Her larger scale works, and this is her current installation at LACMA, Helen Pashgian, Light Invisible. Her larger scale work of the last decade has our continuation of her exploration and of light and perception. And they really have something for me in common, is that they slow down the viewer. When you look at these works, whether the small ones or these large-scale works, indeed one could spend a very long time looking at the myriad of subtle effects conjured by this piece and walking around it and just taking it all in. And if you have not seen this gorgeous piece yet, I really encourage you to do so before the installation closes on June 29. There is in Helen's work a strong underlying tension between material and immaterial. And I'm going to use again James Turrell's word, who was wondering, does she spiritualize the material world or materialize the spiritual? And he leaned towards the latter. The ethereal quality of her work is actually based on or made possible by a very high level of craftsmanship and a very exacting use of materials and process, and a great attention to details. This has made her an especially interesting case study for Art in LA. So I would like to welcome Helen on stage, if you don't mind, Helen. Thank you for being with us tonight. And I would like to also welcome another very distinguished guest, and it's Carol Eliel. Carol is the curator of modern art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, LACMA, and she has been with the museum since 1984. She has curated countless fascinating exhibitions, and currently she has no less than 2 on view simultaneously at LACMA. One is Helen's installation, Light Invisible, and the other is the first major museum retrospective of John Altoon that just opened and is also a wonderful show worthy of a visit, if not several. Carol received her BA from Yale University and her MA and PhD from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University. She has served as the president of the Association of Art Museum Curators, of which she is now a lifetime trustee. She's the recipient of many honors, but there was one I had to mention, being a French national, and is that she was made a Chevalier de l'Ordre des Arts et des Lettres in 1999 for her dedication to presenting the work of French artists to the American public. So thank you for that, Carol. And now we have the pleasure of having her here. Please welcome me and join me in welcoming Carol. I would also like to point out that Jack Brogan, who's a longtime collaborator of Helen, is here, is the handsome gentleman in the jeans shirt in the front row. And so he will be available to answer technical questions later on. The first question I want to ask, since you've been working so much with Jack and you always emphasize how he's really taught you to polish, I want to know who's the biggest perfectionist, you or Jack?
I think it's Jack. Oh. This, by the way, is the first time I've seen this, so I didn't quite know what to expect. No, Jack has kept not just me, but quite a few people on the straight and narrow for a long, long time. After this episode with this enormous piece that was never recovered, his studio was on Lincoln Boulevard in Venice, and that's where all the artists congregated. And I would go out every day, and he showed me how to actually polish the smaller pieces myself. And so I would be working along and trying to polish them, and Jack would come along very slowly, and he'd say, "Not good enough." And I'd say, "But Jack, I've done the best I can." "No." He said, "Make it nice. Make it nice." And so I would bend down, and he would go like this. We were polishing with water, and he would go like this. And then I would lean down and see that there were a lot of little hairline scratches. So I had to keep going and going. He was a very tough taskmaster, but eventually I learned to polish it. And the great thing was finally he'd come and say, "It's nice. It looking nice."
We're going to go back often, by the way, to this disc motif, because it's such a gorgeous photograph. But before we talk more about the disc and the old one and the new one, I wanted to go back a little bit to the beginnings, and when you transitioned from oil painting to this new material and made these spheres and beautifully colored. But I remember talking once with you, and you described the process that was more akin to home cooking than really high tech.
Oh, yeah.
Do you remember how you?
Oh yes, it was. I didn't have a studio, and it was in a back bedroom somewhere where I was casting these. And polyester resin is an extremely toxic and a terrible smelling thing, but I didn't know anything else. It was mostly hit and miss in those days. With me, it was mostly miss. And I didn't have any molds. I didn't know what to do. So I would finally go to the market and buy these lettuce shakers, and I'd put the mold in. I'd pour the material in, and it would usually fail, and I'd get another mold, and I would keep working. And finally, these worked, and I attended a luncheon seminar at Caltech when I was a resident artist there with the head of the chemical engineering department, who was an expert in the world of polymers. But he was an expert in the theoretical world of polymers that made a polyester resin. He had no idea that artists were using some of these materials or why they would use them, and what the results might be. So there's a very funny story that some of you may have heard before, that when I went to that luncheon seminar, he said, "I'd like you to bring one or two of these small spheres, and there'll be about 20 or 30 gentlemen from Caltech and JPL, Jet Propulsion Lab, and I'd like you to explain the process, because after all, Caltech is all about science." And so I went naively, and I put them on the table. I also had old 35 millimeter slides, which I showed. And they were all quite interested, except for one man. And the more I talked about the casting process, the angrier he became. And he got very, very, very angry and very quiet and clenched his fists. And I knew that there was something very wrong, but I didn't know what was wrong. And so finally, he said, I was explaining how I would cast a cylinder. These are all cast from the inside out. How I would cast a clear cylinder or a cylinder that would have green on one side and red on the other. And then I would cast it into a hemisphere. And he said immediately, oh, that won't work. That will crack. You can't cast a hard edge onto a very rounded edge like this. The head of the department said, well, she was able to do it. And he said, well, it won't work. There's no way that it can work. And I said, well, there are a lot of variables that we had to deal with. The temperature, we had to deal with the humidity, and a number of other things. And he said, I don't care what she says, there's no way that that will work. And so a few of them started giggling and tittering, and he said, well, you have it before you. At which point, this man got up and walked out of the room and slammed the door behind him. So I said, Dr. Churgill, who was the head of the room, I said, I'm terribly sorry that I've offended him. I don't know what I've done wrong. I don't know what I've said. He said, well, you know, Helen, he said, you had no way of knowing. You have just demolished his entire doctoral thesis.
Doctoral thesis. No.
She has just gotten one. I'd like to say one more thing about Caltech. That was an amazing dividend, and that is that the artists worked in an old biology building that was slated to be torn down, and there were a lot of little rooms. And next to the room where I was sanding this big 60-inch diameter disc, the whole room was filled with white dust. And next door to me, there was another small room, and in that room, Richard Feynman, the Nobel laureate in physics, was in there painting. Because he was a great, some of you may remember him, and he wrote the famous book, Surely You're Joking, Mr. Feynman. And he was also the one that you remember discovered the O-ring on the, okay. So we would have a lot of talks, and he'd say, Helen, don't come in here, you're too dirty, you're covered with white dust from top to bottom. But we'd talk, he'd be in there doing some fleshy nudes, and we'd talk and talk about process. And he said, you know, actually, the only difference between what you do and what I do in physics is the end result. In physics, we do something that we hope will be useful, and you do something which is entirely useless. Except insofar as, except in this way, he said, that it may be the most useful thing in that it transforms lives in the world. Okay. And so there is a very interesting question, he said, between what is useful and what is useless. And I never forget that particular conversation. And then we became quite good friends and spent a lot of evenings in hot tubs naked. I remember it was after all the 60s.
Now we're talking.
It was the 60s. But the most memorable thing was in the studio that I had, that I still have, I remember there was a very large single piece of resin, was it, Jack, that was you repaired a piece for Ron Cooper, and you didn't need it anymore, so I bought it from you. And around that, I would have dinner parties that would seat 24 to 30 people. And at one of the dinner parties, one was in honor of Count Panza. He was in this country and collecting light and space work, as many of you know. What I did not know until just before the dinner party was that he was obsessed with scientists. Obsessed. He loved science more than art. So I said, well, I'll get my friend Richard Feynman, and I also had Paul McCrady, the famous aerodynamicist, at the same dinner party. And so Count Panza was sitting at one end in a perfect Armani suit like a little Renaissance prince, and the two scientists were here. And that particular evening, Paul McCrady was talking about a car that he'd made, an aerodynamically perfect car, he thought, and it was had been racing across the Nullarbor Plain, which I think is in the southern part of Australia. right? Anybody know? I think so. And Richard Feynman was asking him questions about it. And so Panza was sitting like this at the end of the table. The two scientists were, he was going. He told me later it was the most remarkable dinner party he'd ever attended in his life. And how was I able to produce two of the most famous scientists in the world? So I would say it was a success. But those were some of the dividends that came from being a resident artist at Caltech in those days.
Helen, can I ask you a question about Caltech? You talk about it. It sounds as if the as if the artists were almost laboratory rats or something, that the scientists were observing, you know, as you did a little show and tell of how you used your materials and what you did. Did you feel that other than these more informal and sort of sidebar relationships that you developed, did you actually learn things from the scientists at Caltech, or not so much?
No.
They learned from you, it sounds.
The Caltech experiment was 2 years was an entire debacle. It was a great failure. The intent had been that postdoctoral candidates and scientists would meet with us and talk with us and watch what we were doing. The artists didn't show up very much, and the scientists were never around, partly because the man that ran the program was there for other reasons of his own. He was finally deported back to South Africa. So it wasn't a very successful program, all in all. And so there was no interaction except this infamous luncheon that I attended.
And it did give you an opportunity to meet the other artists, so I guess that was positive.
Yeah.
Well, there is in the Caltech catalog, there is a picture for the artists, and I think the one for Peter Alexander is of him in bed with Billy Al Bankstone in smokings. So that would say something. But there was also some more serious aspects to this residency. I think you got in touch with some chemical companies, Rom and Haas, and
yes, Dow Chemical and Rom and Haas. We contacted the executive branch, and they brought some of their scientists, some of their chief chemists, that had lunch with us and talked with us. And they were very interested that we were using these materials and gave us quite a few samples, and were interested in the experiments we were doing. And because they thought that these would grow and grow and grow, and they'd get some very good publicity for it, I'm sure.
And stepping back to the spheres for a minute, because I also want to talk about the shift between the spheres and the disc. I mean, the colors are so remarkable in these spheres. First, I wanted to ask you, Carol, to comment on the role of color in Helen's work, maybe?
Well, I think it's something that has run throughout the work and clearly is a part of the cast pieces, and is still a part of the molded form pieces that Helen is making now, the columns. The columns at LACMA, the forms themselves don't have color, but the internal components do, and you've also made columns in various colors. So I think it's something that runs through all of the work and is clearly a beautiful aspect of the work. You should talk about it, not me.
Do you want to talk how you imparted the color in this? Do you remember?
I don't remember a lot of that. The colored dyes that were compatible with, at that time, with this material in transparent dyes were very limited. And so some of them are mixed colors, some of them are pure colors. And it was important to use very, very little, because if you got too much of the dye, it would become too dark and
Too opaque?
No, they never became opaque, but they would just become so dark that the light transference that I was interested in would not occur.
And they completely retain the light transfer, even with the color.
But with these spheres, and with other shapes that I made at that time, most of them are lost. As you walk around them and as they turn, the colors begin to revolve, because you get quite a bit of distortion within that, within them. The eye does quite a lot of interesting things, and of course they reflect back everything.
With these spheres in particular, is that there was a few artists working in polyester at that time, but I think you're the only one who really exploited the different, properties of different plastics And that implies a very sophisticated understanding of the properties of the material. Do you want to say how you obtain these effects for people who don't know here on these spheres?
Yes, but what I wanted to say was that I think the person who really understood this material and really explored it in depth was Dwayne Valentine, because he explored it, and he did huge works.
Right.
And he really had to comprehend the way it behaved in a way that I, working with smaller pieces, didn't need to. I think there were a lot of issues that he dealt with that no one else dealt with.
Oh, certainly with
So I would say that he was the primary one as far as comprehending it. But each person that worked with it had sufficient problems.
Yeah.
That it was all quite challenging. And since we're here to talk about primarily the technical aspect of these materials today, the green piece, which is what Rochelle has been following from its birth up to to the present, is not finished yet. This is the very beginning where Jack Brogan and one of his workmen and myself are measuring on the floor how the circumference, right?
See this? We see a line around it. It means you basically cut it. That's the internal black line is.
It's so long ago, I'm having trouble remembering, but I think that this was a piece of acrylic that I just taped and poured
really?
a big thick pancake of resin on.
Okay.
And I can't remember how I got the square in it at the end, but we're working on that. It's extremely time-consuming and extremely difficult, but we hope that it will be finished and shown very soon in a show that's coming up next month.
Well, does it make a difference working now with epoxies versus working then in the resins?
Thank you for asking that. Polyester resin nobody uses anymore. It's very, very dangerous. And this industrial epoxy has none of those sorts of dangers. It's a totally different material, behaves completely differently, and is not easy to work with, but a lot easier and it is more stable. And so when the piece is finally finished and finally vertical.
So Carol was mentioning figuring out the epoxy versus the polyester, and there's something that always intrigued me is, okay, you mentioned you were the only woman in this world of man artists, and you picked up this industrial, material that are not precisely feminine and dainty. And I remember you had a funny story of when you picked up epoxy and you rang up the company saying you wanted to work with them.
Well, first of all, Rochelle, you know that I'm not the only woman in this group.
I know.
There are about three women. When I first began to work with the epoxy, I just bought a gallon of epoxy somewhere, and I had quite a lot of trouble with it. I added catalyst, bearing in mind the old formulas I used to know, and none of it worked. It would turn black, it would crack, it would do all kinds of things. And I was working on a very flat surface, almost like a painting, but I was pouring it in layers, and it was absolutely terrible. So I didn't know who to turn to. I had talked to everyone I had known at Caltech, and so I looked on the label, and I saw that it was made at a certain company in Visalia. So there was a telephone number, and I called them up about 8:30 in the morning, and I said, hello, my name is so-and-so, and I've been working with your material 5X1015, and I'm having quite a bit of trouble with it. I'm an artist. And I'll never forget the response. This man said, honey, we don't work with artists. At which point, I wasn't quite sure what to do. But it seemed to me that there was only one thing to do. And so I put these terrible experiments in the car, got out my old fold-out map, and headed north. And I went over the Grapevine, and I got onto the 99, and I went halfway up the state of California, almost, to Visalia. And I found this company. It was a very small company. On one side, the cows were grazing in the field. On the other side was this. And I walked in carrying two of these terrible things. And I said, how do you do? My name is Helen Pashgian. I spoke to someone here early this morning. It's now noon. And I would like to, it's not too difficult, I would like to speak with one of your chemists. And they said, just a moment. And they went in the back room, and a very nice man walked out and said, how do you do? I'm Mr. Smith, something. I'm the president of the company. Who are you? And so I put them down and showed them to him and said I was trying to experiment with your X15, whatever it was. Oh, he said, those are quite interesting. And I said, well, you can see that they're cracked and they're this and they're all globbed up in one. And I don't know how to use it. Oh, he said, come in the back room with me. And we walked in, and all the chemists were in there working. And so they looked at it and they said, oh, we'll show you what to do. So I stayed the entire afternoon. The president of the company was so nice. He said, you need to learn a little more. You spend the night come to my house and my wife will have you for dinner. So we had a wonderful dinner, and we talked about, they didn't know anything about light and space, knew very little about Los Angeles. They'd never been here. And so we talked and had a wonderful time. The next day I spent half the day working with a chemist. And so I came home, and so it turned out to be a success story. So I guess the moral is you had to be very aggressive in those days. It had less to do with being a woman than being an artist. And because, I think up in Visalia they thought artists were dangerous. They might do something like pee on you or cut off their ear or do something non-social.
So given those kinds of experiences, Helen, did you, and this was right at the same moment as the art and technology project was happening at LACMA, did you ever have any desire or hope that you might be a part of that project, desire to be a part of that project? Did you feel you didn't need it and could just do what you wanted on your own, and it didn't really interest you to be a part of an ongoing project?
Well, I was interested in all of that, but I was I know people don't believe this, but I was very shy. And I never would say anything to anybody about the fact that I might have an interest in something like that. So I just watched it from afar.
Carol, as an art historian, this collusion between art and technology, the LACMA project or the Caltech one, even if it was a failure, was it really something specific to the times or to Los Angeles?
I think it was specific, I think, to that time. I think the fact that a lot of these materials had been developed in the course of World War II, and then, as Helen said, had been declassified and were getting out into the world, and a lot of them were available in craft stores or, not necessarily put forth as art materials, but artists are always curious people who are willing to try all kinds of crazy things. I don't think it's specific, though, to that time, in that, LACMA has now recreated or revived or reinvented, maybe is the best word, an art and technology program. The technology has changed. Artists now are dealing with technology in different ways. But I think artists are basically curious people, and technology, almost by definition, is at the cutting edge of a particular kind of creative thought.
Right.
I mean, I'd be interested to hear your response, that it seems almost a natural that, of course, artists are going to be interested in trying new things and new techniques and new materials because they're curious, creative people.
Well, Helen, I was going to ask you, are you interested in science beyond that it gives you the means of achieving your artistic vision? Or do you want to know what's the working principles behind it, or just to do what you want to do?
I have so much difficulty just doing what I want to do. It's not that I'm not interested, it's just a matter of time, I think.
Right.
There just isn't that much time. I think artists are always interested in the new, Carol, always interested. I think there was a show at the Norton Simon about a year ago that dealt with minimal sculpture.
Beyond Brancusi?
Beyond Brancusi. Did any of you see that show? Well, you did, a lot of you did.
Yeah, quite a few people.
That is an historical show in a way because they own the Brancusi and they didn't move it to the show itself. But it is about minimal sculpture that began in England, and there were some works by Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth and others. And then they moved to New York, and they had Robert Morris. They had the impetus for the show were two amazing Donald Judds that they own, and that were in the basement and hadn't been shown for a very long time. There was a Nevelson and some other work. And then in the last room, were the light and space artists. There was a beautiful, one of the very large 3 or 4 foot square dark boxes by Larry Bell. There was a McCracken, Robert Irwin's disc, and so forth. And I think what's interesting about this is one has always assumed, because the New Yorkers always said that all minimal sculpture began in New York, and the Californians just came later and were copying them, of course. The actual fact was that the Henry Moores, the New York artists, and the California artists were all working at exactly the same time. All of this work was made at the same time. The difference was that, for example, Henry Moore and Barbara Hepworth were in their 80s or 90s, and we were all in our 20s or early 30s. But all this work was made at the same time, which puts it all in a very different perspective and a much more needed perspective.
Yeah,
and so this is a very important show that probably needs to be expanded upon. And
I think it's also interesting to note, just in terms of materials, that the New York artists were using industrial techniques, but traditional materials like wood and metal, whereas artists here were using very untraditional materials, resins, epoxies, et cetera. So, you know, vacuum form glass coatings and those kinds of things. So I think that's a really critical difference.
And there was no end of animosity going from east to west. And the most wonderful story, because I was part of it, and Jackie will remember this, in 1971, I think it was, Robert Irwin, Laddie Dill, and I all had shows in New York, and Jack Rowan, came back to mount all 3 of the shows. Mine was at Jill Cornbly Gallery uptown. Robert Irwin's was in a very small room, like a large closet at the Modern, and Laddie's was at Sonnabend. And they all opened in the middle of winter in the worst blizzard in 50 years, and no one went to any of the shows. However, in about 2 weeks, the New York Times got wind of it, and other papers, and they sent emissaries out to review them. And I'll never forget one of the they were all very damaging, but the most damaging one said, "This is what we call California art," and they put it in quotes, and they said, it just shows you, it is nothing. It is just atmosphere. And it shows you that these California artists have been in the sun way too long. And frolicking in the ocean, and they've been taking too many drugs, because this is obviously all they can do. Do you remember that? And so we were used to that, and things have changed now, finally.
In your work, there's a very strong influence, and in a way it's transcending something that's not abstract, is the ocean, right? You speak a lot about that.
Yes, I've always been interested in not just surface, the light on the surface, but what would occur and be distorted and transformed under the surface, even 2 or 3 inches, even from the age of 3 and 4 and 5, which I can remember very clearly, playing in the tide pools and all of that. I think someone asked me recently, to be a light and space artist, was it necessary to be a native-born Southern Californian? I don't know about that. I know at least 3 or 4 of them are native-born. I do think it's that those very early, acquaintance with California, with light, as it affects a child, is very, very important. One thing that I've been, and this is a little tangent, been fascinated with in the show at your museum, at LACMA, is that how young children are affected by it. They have an immediacy. I've talked to some children that have been in there, not terribly young, but 7 to 12, 15 years old. They are absolutely enchanted with it. They don't want to know anything about process. All they're interested in knowing is why these images go away and come back, and how they disappear, and why they disappear, and what happens when you bend down and look up. And it's just the whole world to them. They don't have any need to know why, but there is it's really amazing.
I would like to, sorry, Carol,
I have one more question. We're not sure where you were going to go, but the early work was all cast, and now you're molding work, starting with sheet acrylic and molding it. Can you talk a little bit about the different ways that may make you think about the materials or the possibilities of the materials?
Can I show the photo essay from the LACMA columns?
Sure.
Well, these are acrylic sheets in an oven. There they are. They get very soft, and the fabricators, they become like very heavy fabric. And in the left foreground, you see an elliptical mold made out of wood covered with felt. And then it's very hot, it's draped over that, and then they are clamped underneath, and they form an elliptical shape. There are two elliptical shapes. So that, in this case, that becomes a volume of light into which the pieces that I cast are placed. And then they are lit from above, and if the lights above are a 1/4 inch off one way or the other, no image appears inside, or it appears in a very strange and distorted way.
What made you originally even have the notion to move away? Well, you continued to do it, but to add on to your vocabulary, so to speak, from the molded pieces into the sheet?
Well, the molded pieces began as pieces on the wall that became further and further off the wall, like the blue piece that you have.
Right.
And then,
Sorry, I should say moving from the cast pieces
From the cast.
to the molded
to the,
pieces. I mean, that seems like a big jump.
I can't actually remember.
Well, something that intrigues me about this move is you're changing from something that you're doing yourself to delegating. And does that changes your relationship to the work, or does that make any difference at all to you?
Not particularly, because
No.
I have to be very close to it all the time. And Carol, I think I've always been interested in what happens when the viewer moves. One way to understand it is someone said, what is the difference between Terrell's sky spaces and your work? It's very simple. His sky spaces, you sit in one place. You don't have to, but you usually do. And the lights change, the colors change. And with these, they are static, and you move around them, and it changes as you move. So it's more demanding on the viewer in some ways, in other ways not. So I was very interested in a larger format, and I think that's when I began to be interested in folded materials. But the light and space movement that began, we've talked a lot about the late 60s and 70s tonight. It's still ongoing, and most of us are still working and developing.
I want to spend a little time talking about conservation, if you don't mind.
I think we should.
Yeah.
Wrap it up.
I love the comparison with the tank horses. I love the idea that in the 55th century, someone will unearth a Pashgian disc and study it.
Well, I wonder what the hell it is.
Resuscitate
I wonder what
it. But I wanted to ask you, from what you're saying, it sounds like display in a way is almost a part of conservation. Like you could really ruin a piece by not displaying it properly. Is that right, or what do you feel?
With work that is totally dependent on light,
right,
external light, to create the volumetric light that inhabits the piece when it's properly. Would you agree, Carol, that it has to be? We've just gone through the installation of it. It has to be done very precisely.
It has to be done precisely. I wouldn't say that you ruin, you don't achieve the effects that the piece is meant to achieve. You don't necessarily ruin it in terms of you could do it again and do it right, as opposed to leaving something that is so damaged that you can't make it right anymore. But this is the kind of work, I mean, anything from a Peter Alexander wedge to Helen's recent columns, Terrell's projection pieces, if you don't install them properly, Doug Wheeler's rooms, if you don't install them properly, you are not honoring the intentions of the artist. And as a curator or as a private collector, if you have that incredible privilege, I think it is incumbent upon us to honor the artist's intentions and to do it right.
Just trying to think, in 500 years, do you think someone could appreciate the yellowing on a Helen Pashgian piece like they appreciate a golden varnish on an old master's painting, or is this like out of the question?
They don't yellow.
They don't yellow. I love that.
I don't know that we know yet.
We don't know.
We don't know.
You know,
We
these
don't know yet.
materials, as you say, in the year 5500,
Yeah.
we will be long gone. I don't know that the Van Eycks necessarily knew what was going to happen to their paintings over time. So it's hard to say. I mean, I think that if an artist feels so strongly that something has to be perfectly clear, for example, and that any yellowing is not acceptable, then the artist has to kind of say that up front say, at a certain point, if it's not clear anymore, then it's not showable.
Yeah.
But I think we sort of learn to roll with the punches, so to speak. And if you look back to very early plastic pieces, Namgabos or Pevsners or Moholy-Nages, they have all aged, some of them better than others. We still exhibit them in museums, and they're still considered, wonderful creative objects. So I think they may not be exactly the way the artist had intended them at the beginning or had conceived of them, but we adapt.
Yeah, there's something different about them that we appreciate. But you, Helen, care about the longevity of your pieces. Obviously, you put some effort.
One hopes, you do the best you can, and you sort of then say goodbye to it, and it has a life of its own, and you kind of hope for the best. So the columns are now in good hands with LACMA, and we'll see what happens to them. They may travel for a number of years, and then we'll see.
But also, I would say, as sort of the keepers of objects, museums, we do what we can. We wrap them properly. We handle them properly. There are inherent aspects of materials, as you as a conservator well know, that none of us has control over, that we don't necessarily know what they are. So there are certain things that you can do, and then there are other things that you simply have to learn how to live with or determine if potentially they are stoppable or reversible. But sometimes you don't even know that they're going to happen until they happen.
Right.
So it's tricky, and plastics are right up there at the high end of the tricky scale.
I want to ask you, if you have a last thought that you want to share with us.
I do have a last thought. And it has nothing to do with any particular object, and it's something I was thinking of on the ride over here tonight, and that is this. Carol graciously gave me a little badge, which I wear when I come to LACMA, which is all the time. For the last 2 months. It says, there's a picture of me and a number, and it says independent contractor. And I wear that.
We're an art museum, but we have no category for artists.
And I wear that everywhere, proudly. I was just reading this afternoon a piece by Christopher Knight 2 days ago about the new Peter Plagen's book that has come out on Bruce Nauman. And in there, he talks about how the artist went from serfdom to gaining some independence, and then how the artist was an independent contractor to either a guild or the church or the state. And I was thinking of what an interesting term. And in the world today, if the artist is an independent contractor, to whom is he or she under contract? Because it isn't a guild, and it isn't the church, and it isn't the state. And so perhaps it is just to the world. And I was thinking, concurrent with this, about a wonderful poetic phrase that is incised in stone on the gate at the college that I attended, which was written nearly 100 years ago in 1920. By a president of the college, and you see it as you're leaving, not as you're entering. And it says, "They only are loyal to this college who, in departing, bear their added riches in trust for mankind." I've been dwelling on that phrase for about 50 or more years because it is continually changing, just as the world is continually changing. And so I think the artist, if they act in the world and think of themselves as actors in the world of today, need to continually evaluate what they are saying and what the world is receiving, if the world is receiving their art at all. And it's a difficult task because the world is always changing, and one's perceptions of the world are changing daily. But I think that's perhaps what it is. Maybe we are independent contractors, and we are contracting to a world that we don't know that lies ahead. It's very hard to see the world and comprehend it while you're living it. And so anyway, these are some thoughts that I've had that are not resolved, but I think a lot of artists think of these things in the abstract from time to time. What do you think, Gary?
I think so.
Anyway, those
I
are
think
my
these are
parting
lovely.
thoughts.
I think these are lovely thoughts, and I wish my own Getty badge would inspire me some such deep thoughts on a daily basis. But this has been a wonderful evening, and I want to thank you both so much for your time. And I want to add at a personal level that working with Helen the past 2 years has been extremely inspiring, and as an artist, a person, a woman, and I just learned so much. She's been wonderful, and it's not completely over. We're still hoping to finish this summer and finish the movie. And I want to thank you all for being here. There are some refreshments and drinks outside, and Helen will be available.
If you want to come,
you prefer to questions now? Or
no. If you want to come down and ask me a few individual questions, I'll be here for a few minutes.
And Carol and I will also take questions over a drink or anything else. All right. Thank you very much, and thank you.